So I am in over my head. There's this guy named Iron Gordon, and we're kind of internet friends. He's got a really good YouTube channel and Instagram. You should check him out on both of those things. He does woodworking projects and skateboard stuff and amazing hand-lettered vintage-style signs. They're really impressive. And anyway, we comment back and forth on each other's videos and kind of support each other. And one day, stupidly, I said to him, "Hey man, I love your stuff. We need to collaborate on something." And he said, "Sure, that's a great idea." And then he thought about it for a second and he said, "Oh, I've got an idea. Sometimes I make vintage signs out of old woodworking saws. I paint like old lettering on them and stuff." And I'm like, "That's great. You should do one of those." And he said, "Great, I'll do something and I'll mail it to you." And I'm like, "Great, fine." Totally forgot about it. And then like 3 weeks later, this thing shows up in the mail. It is a vintage, probably late 1800s, lumberjack's cross-cutting saw. It's like 4 feet long. And on it, he's painted in beautiful old-style lettering, always measure twice and cut once. And I got this out of the package and I had two emotions. The first was admiration for his skill, which is impressive. And the second was absolute panic, because how am I going to add to this? How am I going to make this better, or at least not embarrass myself when I make the handle for it? The hell have I gotten myself into? So when you're a little bit terrified, but you can't get yourself out of whatever you've gotten yourself into, the only thing to do is to get to work. So I went over to the table saw, set up a jig to cut consistent size pieces, and cross-cut a whole bunch of little pieces of walnut, and then I did the same thing with maple. I got about 60 pieces together. Then I built a jig. I just took a couple pieces of wood, pin-nailed, and glued them together so I could get a nice, consistent right angle. And I knew I was going to be using glue, so I covered the whole thing in packing tape so that nothing would stick to it. Then I arranged these little pieces in an alternating herringbone pattern. Now the gluing part for this was really tricky. I had to add a little bar on the side that would hold things in sideways, and then right as I was getting ready to glue up, I realized it was going to squeeze out the end, so I had to quick mill up another piece that was going to go on the end and keep everything from just squishing out. Then I drew lines across the top of the pieces so I could keep everything straight, and then I assembled them, gluing each individual piece, putting it into the form and clamping it up. Then I did that again. Then I did that again. Then I left it alone for a while. So I let the whole thing dry overnight, and it looks good. Nice tight lines, no gaps, nice and even. But even though I put the packing tape down, I'm a little concerned about getting it out of the form. So cross your fingers. Huh. Well, I was worried over nothing. Came out just fine. Now I'm going to take it to the table saw, cross-cut off the ends, and rip all the ragged parts off the sides, so I've got a more manageable piece to work with. Looks nice, right? The only problem is, I don't trust it. If you've done many glue-ups, you know that the worst kind of glue-up is end grain. Because at the end grain of the wood, you just have the tips of fibers like this, and there's not a lot for the glue to stick to. And even worse than that is if you try to glue end grain to end grain. There's just no flat surfaces touching there, and it's very, very weak. This thing is nothing but end grain to end grain surfaces throughout the entire thing. And even though it feels nice and strong, I'm really afraid that with everything I still have to do to turn this into a saw handle, it's just going to shatter on me and fly apart. I've got to do something about that. Here's the idea that I've got. I'm going to make up a special jig that's going to let me drill all the way through this thing. I'm using these extra long drill bits. They're cheap, and I'll link to them in the description because they're very worth having around the shop, even just for occasional uses. Once I have a hole through the entire length of this piece, I'm going to epoxy in a 12-inch length of steel rod. And I'm going to drift it in from one end so that it's exactly in the middle. That way I've got space on either end to work on it with tools without hitting the steel rod, but the middle, the part that's most likely to break, it's going to be reinforced in the best way I can think of. Okay. Now comes the fun part. Except when I say fun, I should say frustrating ordeal. Because here's what happened. I went at the thing with the roughing gouge, just like you would with any spindle, but the piece has so much unsupported end grain where the two pieces, where the walnut and the maple pieces meet each other, that big chunks of it were just flying off and leaving huge cracks in the surface. But okay, fine, the roughing gouge is a rough tool, no big deal. Switched to a homemade square nose scraper, which looked very promising at first. Took tiny little bites working my way in. Stopped the lathe. Yeah, still not good. Still lots of pieces of wood getting knocked out there. Finally, figured out that a super sharp bowl gouge used at a very, very accurate angle worked really well, except that the spindle's too long, and in the middle, it flexes a lot. So you get chatter and marks and still stuff flying all over the place, and I'm experimenting with it and figuring it out, and I'm just figuring out the perfect, light, skimming cut that's going to let me get a good surface in the middle when the thing just snaps in half on me. So, I epoxied it back together, put in an extra supporting rod at one of the places where there wasn't a rod, because I was afraid the tools would hit it. And then I just abandoned tools entirely and went with sanding, and that allowed me to finally get a good surface and get the size I need to actually fit in the saw. Okay, so this is pretty good. It looks nice and it's got the right shape. And in a normal crosscut saw where you were just holding it and sawing the wood like this, the handle would just be a plain stick, just like this. But since this is a decorative piece anyway, I want to do a little bit more with it. I think what would look cool is if I had a nice sphere on each end. Nothing too big, because that would look weird, but a nice proportionate sphere made out of the same maple and walnut. And that detail would just finish the whole thing off. So I've glued up a couple of blanks of walnut and maple scraps. I'm going to take these to the bandsaw and cut them into rough cylinders, get them on the lathe and get them round, and then get them into a roughly cylindrical shape. Then I have to make cups for the headstock and the tailstock, so I can sort of jam the sphere in between the two of them and rotate it, slowly taking off the high spots and creeping up on that perfect cylinder shape. I've never done this before, but Frank Howarth has a great video on it. I'll link to it in the description. He really goes through it very clearly and easily, and it makes me feel like I can get it right on the first shot. After that's done, I'm going to have to jig up something for the drill press so I can drill these safely and on the correct angle, and then I should be able to assemble the whole thing. And then here, obviously, is the finished product. And I'm pretty Wait, no, this doesn't feel right. I don't like this. Could we fade to white and go to some glamour shots? Oh, much better. That looks so much more professional. And what I was trying to say was, I'm pretty happy with the way this came out. I wasn't kidding at the beginning of the video when I said Iron Gordon's skill kind of intimidates me. I completely suck at 2D art. I can't draw or paint or anything. So somebody that can hand paint this kind of vintage pinstripe style lettering, that's just something I can't compete with. And again, this isn't a competition. It's a collaboration. We're supposed to work together and bring what we have to the table. And what I've got is woodworking and turning. And since all I had to do was the handle didn't come out too bad. I had a pretty good idea, and it came together well. Now, I would do more segmented turning in the future, but the thing you really have to be careful with is it's just incredibly fragile. The steel reinforcement post, that was a really good idea. I would definitely do that again. But if you're going to do some sort of segmented spindle, you have to understand that it's totally an aesthetic, decorative thing. It has almost no ability to bend or flex. It just snaps. But if you're going for that look and it doesn't need to be load-bearing, go for it. It is worth the time and effort to make something so intricate and unusual looking. I've never seen a segmented saw handle before. You'll have to decide if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I don't know. Either way, this video, like all of my others, wouldn't be possible without my patrons on Patreon. Because of them, I get to do artistic, fun projects like this, projects for the community, and I get to do this full time instead of doing fabrication work and making things like cabinets, which honestly, I completely hate making. So, if you're interested in this content, if you like seeing fun projects unbiased reviews, unsponsored content, go over to patreon.com/RexKruger where you can check out the rewards, exclusive content, early access, and giveaways that I have just for my patrons. And even if you don't want to become a patron, I love having viewers. So thanks so much for watching.